Welcome to the History of Witchcraft, a webinar brought to you by the Champaign Public Library in partnership with the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Illinois. We are overjoyed that this webinar has garnered so much interest, both here in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and worldwide. I'm Madeline Wolski, the business librarian at Champaign Public Library. I encourage you to visit our website at www.champaign.org or follow us on social media for more free events and lifelong resources. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers who curate magical manuscripts, Dr. Cait Coker and Ruthann Miller.
Thank you for that fantastic introduction. My name is Ruthann Miller, and we have about 45 minutes prepared for you, complete with items from the Rare Book and Manuscript Library's collection. Before we get started, there is one big disclaimer that we'd like to address. We will be exclusively discussing Western European witchcraft, specifically between about 1400 and 1700. To begin, how are we defining and describing witchcraft? The essential characteristics of witchcraft underwent a change around the 1400s. Prior to this, witchcraft, or what we would think of as witchcraft, was focused on pagan beliefs and folk traditions. It was the village healer that used local herbs to cure illness. It was the midwife who could save the life of a newborn baby and its mother. It was the practitioner who could summon rain in a drought. Our first item is an Ostracon that dates to about 500 to 700 CE. An Ostracon is a piece of pottery that has been broken off an earthen vessel and then used as a writing surface. Typically, the pieces are broken off first and then the writing was added. It was pretty convenient to use these fragments as writing surfaces because they can be really durable and portable. This one that we are looking at here is from Egypt and is written in Coptic. According to the inscription, this is a magical charm. If you look closely, there is a representation of a winged figure surrounded by Coptic text. A small piece of pottery or wood with an inscription could be turned into a protection charm that would be easy to carry. As I mentioned earlier, things began to change around the 1400s though. Witchcraft came to have a twofold emphasis, maleficia and demonolatry. Maleficia is, essentially, acts of harmful magic. For example, a practitioner uses magic to decimate a field of crops. Maleficia is also the basis for most definitions of witchcraft around the world. Honestly, there is nothing abnormal about including maleficia. There is good, bad, and lots of in-between in all of us, witches as well. The counterpoint to maleficia is benevolent magic, which is pretty much what it sounds like, magic that has well-meaning intentions. For example, healing a sick or injured person. For the most part, benevolent magic was tacitly allowed for a significant period of time. However, during the 1400s and 1500s, the Catholic Church began to change its stance and decided that magic was unacceptable, regardless of the practitioner's intentions. This brings us to the real key to defining Western European witchcraft, demonolatry. Demonolatry is the intentional worship of and subservience to demons. This aspect of witchcraft is specific to the time period and location we are discussing, Western Europe between 14 and 1700. Before we really dive into the demonolatry aspect, we're going to talk a little bit about heresy. In many respects, the development of medieval witchcraft is closely bound to heresy and the struggle to express religious feeling beyond the limits of what the Catholic Church would tolerate. The Church and European witchcraft are so closely intertwined because, in many ways, you cannot have one without the other. In order to worship the Christian devil, you must believe in the Christian devil, which means you need to be Christian. This complex relationship between witches and demons is a characteristic of Christian witchcraft. Essentially, European witchcraft is a compilation that draws upon folklore, heresy, demonology, and Christian theology. So what were these witches doing with these demons? Supposedly, they were signing pacts with the devil and worshipping demons in order to gain supernatural powers. For context, the medieval church, on some level, expected people to believe in demons. Demonic possession was not really considered witchcraft, but actively signing a pact with the devil was. Accused witches were charged with not just signing the devil's book, but also sealing their pact by copulating with the devil himself. They were also accused of partaking in the Sabbat, which was essentially a mass orgy in the woods hosted by the devil and his demons. It is important to note that the Sabbat does not appear in medieval witchcraft until the end of the 1400s. As mentioned earlier, this is in line with the shift in the perceived practice of witches. I'd also like to take a moment and point out that the Black Mass and covens were not part of medieval witchcraft. For a pop culture example of these, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina has a Hollywood version of a coven, a Black Mass, and the relationship between the devil, demons, and witches. But how did witches get to these Sabbats in the woods? They flew on their broomsticks, of course. The image of a witch flying on a broomstick is pretty iconic, but there are some important historical aspects that we're going to talk about. First of all, the ability to fly is a product of the use of flying ointment. Flying ointment is a salve usually made from some types of toxic plants that are rubbed onto the body and gives the feeling of flying. Of course, this is not literal flight, this is spiritual. The two aspects of this that become hugely problematic around the 1400s revolve around how the salve was made and how it is applied. In a nutshell, salves are put onto the body using rendered animal fat or vegetable oil. However, as the fear of witches began to grip Western Europe, people accused witches of using the fat of babies. This was supposedly happening at the Sabbats in the woods. Witches would bring babies or small children to sacrifice to the devil and then use the fat to create flying ointment. Compounding this is the manner in which people assumed witches applied the salve. Some modern researchers assert that flying ointment is best applied to a mucous membrane, such as the armpits. Another conveniently located mucous membrane is the vulva, which is where the idea of a broomstick as a sex toy comes in. The theory goes that witches used the fat of babies to apply a flying ointment to their broomsticks, which they then pleasurably rode to the woods in order to participate in a demon-led orgy where they made agreements with the devil and copulated freely with all beings involved. So we have touched on the relationships that witches supposedly had with the devil, but why is this significant? Modern scholars propose that heresy, indecency, and misogyny were not the only driving factors in accusations of witchcraft and the subsequent trials. This is exclusively between 1400 and 1700. Prior to the 1400s, the Church asserted that angels, demons, the devil, and God all existed on a different plane of existence from humans. Essentially, humans could not physically interact with these entities. However, this idea began to shift in the 1400s. What if humans could interact with these beings? Suddenly, the women accused of carnal relations with demons became witnesses to the reality of the spiritual world. If a witch had sex with a demon, who was in a corporeal body, then the existence of demons could be proven. And if you could prove the existence of demons and the devil, then God and the angels also existed. While individuals are being tried for witchcraft and accused of cavorting with the devil, there is another aspect of magic that was not typically included. To better explain, I'm going to use the labels given by a few scholars in the field. High magic and low magic. One is not necessarily better than the other, just different. Low magic is used by general practitioners and includes Maleficia. This type of magic is most often associated with illiterate individuals and has strong ties to peasants and folk traditions. High magic is areas such as astrology and alchemy. Being involved with this type of magic typically required a certain level of education and literacy, to include Latin. These two types of magic have different histories and were viewed with radically different opinions. Low magic was associated with demon worship, and the individuals accused of witchcraft most often fell into this category. On the other hand, there are no references to astrology or alchemy in medieval witch trials, and very few hints at other areas of high magic. There are a few areas of expertise that walk the line between magic and early science. The first one I will be talking about involves herbals. An herbal is a compendium of plants with useful information and typically drawings. This text, On the Virtues of Herbs, was printed in the late 1400s, but it is similar to the manuscript versions that would have been in use during the medieval period. Some scholars would say that the information in herbals was simply copied from the classical authors without any grasp on the contents. Cut and paste, if you will. On the other hand, and I fall into this category, Other scholars argue that information was understood and the texts were copied for practical usage. Herbals could be powerful resources that allowed individuals to keep a record of information as well as pass it on to the subsequent generations. Let's take a look at a few of these entries. The first entry here is for chamomile. As you can see, there is an illustration of what the plant looks like, followed by a description of its appearance, traits, and uses. This would be especially useful when trying to determine which herbs to use. This next entry might be a bit easier to decipher. It's an onion. Again, there is description, image, and text. You'll note that the text is in Latin, which is fairly standard for the period. For the last page here, what I want to share with you is not really the plant, but rather the marginalia left by the previous owner. Marginalia is the writing that you see in the margins. We still do this today when we write notes in our books. You can see here that the previous owner wrote extensively over the image on this page. The reason herbals walk the line between magic and early science is their relationship to village healers and wise women, as well as contemporary physicians. Herbal knowledge was essential to the practice of medicine. The drawings, location information, and qualities of the plants also played a crucial role in early botany and natural history. Another area I want to touch on is alchemy. What do you think of when I say alchemy? Transmuting minerals into gold? The Philosopher's Stone from Harry Potter? These aren't wrong. In fact, during the medieval and the classical period, alchemy was considered a legitimate science. However, it also crossed into the realm of magic. High magic, yes, but still magic. What we are looking at here is a handwritten manuscript by Sir Isaac Newton, dating to around the 1690s. What is unique about this is the contents. Newton is writing about alchemy. First of all, the text is in Latin because at the time, Latin was used for nearly all academic writings. This is an attempt to create the Philosopher's Stone. Now, it does not say what the starting material is. Is it copper? Quartz? Who knows? But if you're an alchemist worth their salt, then you already know which material to start with. The text continues with the steps taken and the results. Spoiler alert, Newton did not make the Philosopher's Stone. However, this text is really important for another reason. Around this time, science is beginning to change. The scientific process is emerging. Alchemy, for all its ties to magic, is one of the forebearers to modern chemistry. In this text, Newton is using the scientific method to make an attempt at creating the Philosopher's Stone. He is blending alchemy and chemistry, science and magic. In 1487, Heinrich Kramer published the Malleus Maleficarum, translated as the Hammer of Witches. Here we have the RBML's copy of the Malleus, dated 1496. Kramer's work would become a guidebook of sorts and was designed to aid in the identification, prosecution, and dispatching of witches. The Malleus would also go on to become notorious for its misogynistic text. The first part of the text sets out to confirm the existence of witches and then points out the necessity of identifying and arresting practitioners. Part 2 covers the stuff that witches could do. This includes hailstorms, turning men into beasts, and other nefarious acts. Finally, Part 3 covers what to do with a witch once they have been captured: imprisoning, questioning, and passing judgment. The most infamous section, Part 1, Chapter 6, explains why it is mostly women who are involved with demons and quotes all of the most unflattering and hateful sections on women in the Bible, classical literature, and Christian theology. Earlier, we discussed the carnal relations that women were having with the demons. In the text of the Malleus, as you can see here, Kramer is writing, in Latin of course, about the incubi and succubi that are cavorting with the witches. He goes on to claim that women are particularly susceptible to evil superstitions. This is not to say that men were never accused of witchcraft. They were. Men were accused, went to trial, and died. However, the vast majority of accusations were women. The Malleus became a popular text as the fear of witches settled over Europe. Between 1487 and 1669, there were 28 editions of the Malleus published, all in Latin. So this brings us to roughly 1500. You have a bit of background knowledge on the history, and you've seen a couple of the items, so at this point, my colleague Cait will be taking over.
Thanks, Ruthann. Hi, I'm Cait Coker. To pick up from where Ruthann left off, I want to talk about a few things that set the stage for our next examples. First, we're going to shift geographically from discussing Western Europe generally to discussing England specifically. There's a few reasons for this, one of them being that the RBML's own holdings in British literature and cultural history are particularly strong. Another reason is that we can use England as a case study in how witch trials actually commenced during the period. Something I can't emphasize enough is how omnipresent the belief in the supernatural really was during this time period. We simply don't have a frame of reference for it today. For example, let's take a term like genius. If you were to describe Sir Isaac Newton as a genius, no one would argue with that, as we owe many of our foundational principles of mechanics and optics to his work. However, in his own time, you would not say someone was a genius, you would say they had a genius, a benevolent external spirit providing help and inspiration. On the flip side, the world was just as full of malign spirits, and there were any number of ways to avoid their attention and influence. This included prayers, but those could only last so long because you had to be speaking them aloud constantly. A better option would be to inscribe or decorate objects with symbols called Apotropaic Marks, more commonly called witches' marks, that could deflect malign spirits or protect a specific space. It was believed the lines and patterns in these marks could trap or confuse evil entities, and so they are frequently found in period churches and buildings and even on some period furniture. Just last week, a small church in England was found to have these markings, which goes to show how we're constantly learning about the past. It's also worth keeping in mind that as the Catholic Church was doubling down on identifying and persecuting witches, it was facing upheaval from within. In 1517, Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, setting off decades of religious upheaval and beginning the Protestant Reformation. Now, one way to block or discredit heretics and discourage new Protestant converts was to identify them as witches and execute them by, you probably guessed it, burning at the stake. This was a common execution form for religious heresy and also why it's so identified with witchcraft today. Now, in England, it's worth keeping in mind that stake burnings were quite rare. Most of those condemned in such a way were usually executed by hanging instead. Further, England saw a significantly lower rate of witch trials and executions. While it's estimated that during this period some 40,000 to 60,000 were tried and killed on the continent, in England it is estimated that there were only about 2,000 trials with some 500 executions across the same period. King Henry VIII ruled from 1509 until 1547. When the Reformation began, he wrote an avid defense of the Catholic Church, for which the Pope gave him the title of the Defender of the Faith, a title which has likewise been held by English rulers ever since, and notably with almost none of them being Catholics. Indeed, Henry became a big fan of Protestantism when he decided divorce was a thing and began his epic wife binge. In 1542, Henry's government also passed a Witchcraft Act that defined witchcraft as being magic used to hurt people, to get money, or to behave badly towards Christianity, a pretty mild definition. After Henry passed, there were several years of short-lived interim rulers, and things got really bloody between the Catholics and the Protestants. Finally, in 1558, Elizabeth I came to the throne and things settled. It's really worth noting that the numbers of bloody executions go down dramatically when you have a stable ruler in government. Go figure. In 1563, the Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments, and Witchcrafts was passed, which expanded on Henry's Act to specify that those killed with magic be punished with death as well. Now, this is interesting because one of the foremost members of Elizabeth's court was John Dee, a noted occultist, antiquarian, and some argue intelligencer or spymaster. Dee was also the royal astrologer, and it was fashionable and even customary for nobles at the time to consult astrologers for prognostications of the future. Dee also was inspired by the Rosicrucian movement, which, like the Renaissance humanism of the continent, drew upon classical works as well as more exotic esoterica to examine both the physical and the spiritual worlds. He also wrote several Hermetic manuscripts and possibly owned the famous Voynich manuscript, which is yet to be deciphered to this day. In short, Elizabeth's law distinguished between the good magic and the Maleficia that Ruthann described. And so here's a manuscript entitled Craft of Conjuring and How to Rule the Fiery Spirits of the Planets and Make the Devil Appear. It was written by an unknown author around 1590, towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, and is indicative of the high magic that Ruthann referenced earlier. This manuscript combines Christian theology with Greek astrology and what appears to be Kabbalist charts. So it was drawing on the Hermetic and Rosicrucian eclecticism that was in vogue at the time. That said, several of our colleagues have asked us if we're going to try summoning something as part of our lecture, and the answer is no. No, we are not. Finally, something I want to conclude with before moving on is that this book is an example of a manuscript made for circulation. You'll notice that it's written as what we would call a fair copy, meant to be easily readable to others, as opposed to the messy notes you'd more likely make for yourself. During this time period, print was popular, but manuscript circulation remained a way to distinguish your work as rather highbrow. Plus, you didn't have any state censors who would interfere. It is not, however, anything like what we might think of as a Wiccan Book of Shadows or anything like that. This is again firmly rooted in Christian theology, even if it is drawing some of its practice from Eastern traditions. Now, Elizabeth dies in 1603, and her cousin King James of Scotland immediately becomes the new monarch of both countries. Scotland had a very different relationship to witchcraft, with a much higher rate of trials and executions, most of which were directly attributable to James himself. James was incredibly anxious about witches. I mentioned the witch marks that people would draw on buildings and belongings for protection, and these marks have been found many times over the years in rooms where James stayed or visited. He was fanatical about identifying and getting rid of witches, and he wrote a book about it entitled Demonology. Amongst other things, he argues that the identification of witches should be its own branch of theology, and that even small children are viable witnesses to the court. This will be very relevant later. He also differentiates between witchcraft and necromancy, stating that witches are servants to the devil, while necromancers are the devil's masters. In 1604, he updated the Witchcraft Act of his predecessors, allowing penalty of death without benefit of clergy and moving witchcraft trials from the ecclesiastical courts to the common courts, meaning you could try witchcraft alongside offenses such as theft, assault, perjury, or murder. King James was also an unpopular ruler. Not only was he following the golden age of Elizabeth, he was a bit of a bully who attempted to persecute poets he didn't like. He wanted to arrest Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene, for instance, because he felt that the poem's villainess resembled his mother, and who wanted to fully combine the governments of England and Scotland, which the parliaments of both countries were vehemently opposed to. He also had a string of male favorites, probably lovers, that some people were less than thrilled about. Early in his reign, there were several attempts against his life, most notably in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. What happens is that a plot is discovered in which dissident Catholics would blow up Parliament and kill the king, while leading a popular revolt which would eventually see James's 9-year-old daughter installed on the throne as a Catholic head of state. If you know anything about English child rulers, you know how well this would go for the kid. If you don't, well, it turns out that child rulers have a nasty tendency to get murdered and replaced pretty quickly. An anonymous letter was sent detailing the whole plot, and people were immediately arrested and executed. The day is saved, and ever after, the English celebrate Guy Fawkes Night, after the man who was responsible for guarding the gunpowder, and remember, the 5th of November. Also, we're so used to seeing those anonymous masks today, but those are Guy Fawkes masks, so you get the sense of how much this is stuck around today. Now, this incident leads to the invention of 3 of the most popular witches of all time. Written in 1606, and some think maybe commissioned by James or some of his followers, is a popular play called Macbeth by a playwright you may have heard of named William Shakespeare. The play concerns the murder of a Scottish monarch that is inspired by 3 weird sisters who chant double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble. With the king murdered, the country descends into disorder until the murderer is killed and the rightful monarch restored. It's classic state propaganda that draws heavily on theological themes connecting the good of the state with the good of the monarch. Fun times. Now, here's a funny story to keep in mind, though. No copy of that anonymous letter currently exists, and indeed it was lost soon after it was found. Some people soon afterwards, and historians today, think that there is a reason to believe that the Gunpowder Plot was manufactured to enable anti-Catholic legislation and to entrench an unpopular monarch through patriotic sentiment. Mission accomplished. Now, just a few years later, in 1612, we have one of the most famous witchcraft trials in all of English history. The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancashire was written by Thomas Potts, who was the clerk for the trials, and it contains brief accounts of the examinations for all of the men and women involved. Interestingly, it is dedicated to Thomas Knight, who is credited with apprehending Guy Fawkes and preventing the Gunpowder Plot. Why would that be? Hold on to that thought. To start off, the area of Pendle and Lancaster was, at the time, a rather poor and somewhat crime-ridden area that had also seen a number of identified Catholics either executed or forcibly moved out of the country. The story starts when Alison Device is on the road and encounters a peddler and wants to buy some pins from him. Here the account gets a bit mixed up. The peddler didn't want to sell pins to her because she was a known witch and he feared she would use them for ill purposes, or possibly he just didn't want to undo his pact for a small sale. Either way, they had some kind of altercation during which Alison curses him, and the peddler appears to have what we would identify today as a stroke, and he falls down and seems to be in damaged health after. Now, interestingly, Alison is the one convinced of her own power here, and she confesses what she did to the man's son, who then brings her before the authorities. From there, the account expands, and Device's extended family is examined, including James Device, who eventually confesses a plan among several families to blow up Lancaster Castle. The authorities interrupt a meeting at Malcolm Tower and arrest everyone there, for a total of some 20 people, men and women, who are brought before the court. By the way, two of the families here, the Devices and the Nutters, perhaps sound familiar to those of you who have read or watched Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. Agnes Nutter and Anathema Device are very much modeled on this historical incident. Now, of these 20 people accused, 11 went to trial, 10 are killed by hanging, and 1 is found not guilty, Alison Gray, whose trial is not reflected in the book. Of the confessions that are wrangled out of everyone, you get the familiar litany of crimes, such as murdering people and children, eating babies, all that good stuff, and again with a weird plot to blow up Lancaster Castle. Modern historians now suggest that this detail is something the magistrates and examiners forced James Device to say to make a clear parallel to the Gunpowder Plot. It is also generally agreed that the meeting at Malcolm Tower was probably a secret Catholic Mass, as it was held on Good Friday, and it has been found that other family members of those involved had previously been executed for being Jesuits. In short, Alison aside, it seems that a lot of what happened was political theater. Eventually, both examiners, shortly after this, are rewarded for their work with better positions and with some lands. Today, Pendle Hill is apparently a popular tourist spot for Halloween and still has a reputation for witchcraft. Perhaps one of the most distressing aspects of these trials is that of Jeanette Device. Jeanette is 9 years old at the time of the trials. Remember earlier I mentioned that James put into law that children were viable witnesses. Jeanette would have been separated from her family during the examinations. She gives testimony against her family, including her mother, that leads to their executions. Some people wonder about this. Did she know what she was doing? Was she coached or led on in some way? We don't know. This 9-year-old kid disappears from the record after this, maybe. 20 years later, there is a Jeanette Device imprisoned and charged with witchcraft and murder. This trial takes place under King Charles I, who had very different policies than his father, and he orders a cross-examination that reveals that the accuser, in that case, fabricated evidence. If this is the same Jeanette, she's pardoned and not executed, but she does remain in jail and eventually dies there. Now, this last book makes an interesting epilogue to this whole story. The Late Lancashire Witches is a play that would have been written and performed as the adult Jeanette Device is being left to literally rot in jail. It was incredibly successful in its time, and it is a comedy capitalizing on the popularity of the witch trials. The plot revolves around a guy who finds his wife is secretly a leader of the Coven of Witches and can shapeshift into a cat. A lot of the comedy apparently revolves around the shift in dynamics when wives are more powerful than husbands. Eventually, she is brought to trial, and resolution comes with the restoration of traditional power roles. The epilogue ends rather thoughtfully with a bit of verse. What of their story further shall ensue? We must refer to time, ourselves to you. Now, reading this in our own time, what can we take away? Well, I would argue that the common themes that have come through in these investigations revolve around how people, and especially marginalized people, are divided when others decide they have something to gain from it. Whether it's the church, the state, or even just your neighbors, you should always ask yourself who wins when society's most vulnerable are being penalized, or when children are being forcibly separated from their parents, or when laws are being rewritten to make the powerful even more so. And on that cheerful note, I think we're ready for some questions, right?
Thank you so much, Dr. Cait Coker and Ruthann Miller. So we've had several questions. The first one being maybe the most important and on most people's minds. Cait, why were you touching that manuscript with your bare hands? Are you supposed to be wearing gloves? I will say that the individual who asked this did do so with no judgment.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the lack of judgment. I appreciate this so much, genuinely. Okay, so here's trivia. Using gloves with books is actually really bad. The cloth of gloves can actually tear on the pages, which with old materials like we're using today, that's incredibly bad. There's natural friction that occurs anytime you're touching a page, right? And I'm sure you guys saw me a few times kind of stumbling a little when like a page started to slip. In this case, when you're wearing gloves, the cloth can catch on things. It's really bad. And in terms of chemicals, like what you always want to do is we have freshly washed hands, both of us. We wash our hands regularly, even before COVID started. On the flip side, another thing to keep in mind, hand sanitizer is really bad for old books. So we will religiously use hand sanitizer outside of the library, and then we wash all the way inside because the chemicals in soaps can actually harm the books as well. Where you do want to use gloves is when you're handling things like art on canvas or photographs or things like that, where what you are mostly going to be touching is materials that are oil-based or things like that, where the natural oils on your fingertips is going to just intrinsically damage them. It's like if you ever pick up a photograph and you know your thumbprint is going to be left on that photo, it's the exact sort of thing. So when we're touching photographs or things like that, gloves, yes. When we are touching books, gloves, no.
Thank you for sharing. That was fascinating. Here's another question pertinent to kind of how the books are made. Can you tell why the books come with some ink stains? And was it common for people to use different colored ink in manuscripts? The symbols in red seem highly unusual.
Okay, so the ink stains is, if you've ever tried to write with a quill, it's terrible. Quills have really sharp edges and they actually blunt really quickly. So if you are actually writing with a quill, you're going to have to stop every few minutes to resharpen it. And sometimes you actually get quill bits in the ends of your books. But the ink that will actually be flowing out of this quill, and remember, there were no roller balls during this period of time. There was nothing like that. You had bird feathers and you carved it very carefully. And if you are not good at this, your ink went everywhere. If you were really good at it, you still had ink getting everywhere because you would be dipping it into your inkwell and you would get ink on yourself. And on top of that, quills are just terrible to write with and you will get ink everywhere. With the differently colored ink, so this is something that actually is going to vary depending on period and on what kind of document you're looking at. If you are looking at something like the medieval documents that Ruthann usually works with, these are documents that are made for a noble audience. So they're going to have lots of color and it's going to be really expensive. If you have something like what I had, which was it was something that could have been owned by a middle class person, buying a little bottle of red ink to have on the side wasn't super expensive at all. It was easy to go back and forth. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So question about one of the books that Ruthann Miller talked about. I think it was the herbal. Which plant was the one with the marginalia?
Oh, I looked that one up. It surprised me. It's ash, like an ash tree. Yep. Oh, Cait's going to pull it up too.
Oh, nice. So while Cait's pulling up the book, have you ever translated some of the marginalia? Do you normally do that at work?
On occasion, but to be completely honest here, I cannot read this handwriting. Older scripts are a acquired skill. And it's actually a whole thing. It's called paleography and being able to read these things. Okay, Cait brought up a really good point about this in a previous conversation. So everyone's kind of upset about the fact that younger generations aren't learning cursive anymore, and the concern is that they won't be able to read cursive in a generation or two or something like that. Same kind of thing. The further you are distanced away from the ability to read that kind of handwriting, you kind of lose that skill set. The letters are formed differently. How words are spelled is differently. And if you're familiar with 1600s English, that does not mean you can read 1600s Spanish or French. It's a very acquired skill, and I can completely, with honesty, say I cannot read this. But if you are interested in it, please feel free to take a gander at it and see if you are can suss out what they're saying.
That's a nice invitation for a screenshot. All right. So another question for Ruthann. Why did the Catholic Church demonize healers? And this was asked when you were, I believe, showcasing the Compendium Maleficarum.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to preface this with this is my non-academic scholarly version of how these go. There's a really long history of women being healers, right? We're talking midwives, the village wise woman, they're just the ones who are handling this. And when we're talking about things like especially midwifery, women knowing how to deliver babies is really important. And to outsiders, this can kind of be this weird mystical thing, like how is this woman able to deliver this baby, and like all of those things. So there's a lot of knowledge that women are holding that men in the church don't have. And there's this power struggle between having that knowledge and not having that knowledge, and how they're interpreting it. There's also, you shouldn't completely discount the fact that they're also still struggling, at least in the 1400s, they're still struggling with pagan religions, traditional religion, folk traditions, all of those things. They're not gone. They're just not openly practiced as much. And for the church, this means that they need to, this isn't as acceptable, and some forms of healing would have been considered magic or falling underneath of the things that aren't permissible for the church because of those boundaries. I hope that answers it enough.
Yes, thank you so much. So here's another question. Are we able to look at these manuscripts and books online? And is there a place where we have a list of all of the manuscripts and books that we've gone over this evening?
Sorry, that was our quiet, who wants this question? So yes, there is a list of the books and manuscripts that we went over. Cait and I created a research guide that can be found on the Rare Book and Manuscript site. We will be posting the link to that when links go out in the chat. So you can click on the research guide, and it's got the bibliography for everything that we used and a couple of other sources if you're interested in them. As for looking at digital content, again, if you go to the RBML's website, we have a digital library. We've also got a couple of manuscripts digitized, and you can take a look. Not all of them are there, but you can go and take a look at them digitally as well. And if you are really interested, you can always send an email to us at askacurator@library.illinois.edu. We'll share that one too. And we can work with you to get digital content as well. We are happy to share. We like it when people look at our books.
What a librarian. And I'll also add in that the Champaign Public Library, we also have had a reading list that we curated about this program, and our online resource, Hoopla, actually does have a copy of, I believe, the Malicious Maleficarum. So very exciting. And we have someone who just asked, can we go more detail on some of the witches' rituals, like the ones that supposedly summon demons, without doing them, of course? Another silent trading of information.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, we're going to share this question. From the historical point, I think that the easy answer to that is you have to understand that this is the historical record written by the individuals who were This is not written by the victims. This is not written by the practitioners. This is not written by the people who are necessarily doing these doing these acts. So you're getting a bit of a biased view of how these things are happening. For example, the whole broomstick thing I talked about. Women were not flying through the air, right? Like, this is not something that happened, but it's being put into these trial records for other reasons. People really believed this, that these poor women were doing these things. So there is a certain biases here when we're talking about summoning demons. The other thing is, it's similar to what we talked about with Newton and the alchemy and his creation of the Philosopher's Stone. For all of these things that they say that they are trying to do, Newton didn't make the Philosopher's Stone. So you can make your attempt at summoning your demons, but that doesn't mean that the demons are going to come. You want to take over now, Cait?
So, in terms of like trying to reconstruct what some people may or may not have done, like for instance, if you look at something like Shakespeare's Macbeth, and there's the famous bit about what was it, Eye of Newt, toe of something. Okay, it's really famous, and of course I'm bungling in front of people. Okay, awesome. But you know, you see references in plays and other materials of the period where it's just kind of like sort of like known folk magic of what you do for this, that, and the other, right? It's like the equivalent of, you know, today we have like the thing about, well, if you want to summon Bloody Mary, you go into the bathroom and you stand in the mirror and you spin 3 times fast and stuff like that, right? So you have this kind of like urban legendary before you necessarily have what we would consider to be urban life, right? You also have some like serious occultists who are writing detailed kind of accounts of this, that, or the other. For instance, John Dee wrote a lot of manuscripts, and his manuscripts still exist, although I'm totally also blanking on where his stuff survives today. But anyway, he wrote a number of things about you know, when he was contacting different, you know, beings and so on. But the thing you have to, you know, think about as well is like, okay, was he actually talking to somebody? Was he making it up because his boss is the queen, and if he takes a step wrong, she can have his head lopped off at any second? Or you know, or is he just someone who is perhaps experiencing reality a little different? You have wide varieties of, you know, why people are doing things or why they think that would work. There's in chat, someone was talking about the flying ointment as a hallucinogen, and yes, when Ruthann was talking about the various kinds of toxic plants, you can see references in other herbals to things that are known to be toxic or to, you know, have effects on people. Basically, people did drugs back then. Good times.
Thank you for reminiscing, Cait. We have another comment. So a lot of these terms, for example, Eye of Newt, wasn't that in reference to a specific plant? We had someone say maybe the daylily or even perhaps mustard seed. I'm just getting head nods. So we'll take it as yes.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Lots of plants had different local names and stuff like that. So yeah. Sometimes you may be getting something called that sounds really exotic, and it's a plant. It's like mandrake fruit, which was described as being like a little baby, and then you look at it, and it's like a root vegetable, and you're like, okay.
Very cool. Here's a question from our live Facebook. A lot of these books and items seem to be written from the perspective of the dominant society. How much writing is preserved from those accused of being witches, if any?
There is not much. I can tell you that RBML doesn't have anything of witches who, of people who are accused of being witches. There are trial transcripts, so to speak, of women who are making their confessions on the stand, or they're doing it in the torture cell beforehand, but these are taken under duress and should not be taken literally. This is, of course, again, another symptom of history is written by the people in power. And if witches weren't, like, there was no way to preserve that level of culture. There's also not necessarily a written culture. A lot of traditions are oral, especially when we're talking about pagan and folk. So an oral tradition it just does not get captured in the same manner in which writing things down.
And then to tag on to that, one of the other things about manuscripts by women is most of the time, because for so long they were considered lesser, like, you know, 100 years ago, a library with a bunch of manuscripts and things like that would probably not even bother, trying to fully catalog materials like this. In the last 20, 30, 40 years, you've actually seen a push by scholars to revisit materials, and a lot of early writing by women are commonly found in collections called domestic papers or miscellanea or things like that. And this is how the kind of history of women's reading and writing has been dramatically expanded over the last few years, because people have actually just started to go back and actually look at what was writing or what has been saved. You also have fun things happening where you have surviving notebooks by women, and people will talk about, trying to argue about whether or not they were actually writing the writing that is held there, or were they copying it for something else. So it's kind of it's a messy history in so many directions.
Thank you both. Cait, was the witchcraft from Hamlet something new that he wrote, or cliche for the time, so he just included it?
I think by witchcraft from Hamlet, you think witchcraft from Macbeth. So that was so Shakespeare is kind of drawing on a lot of the anxiety and paranoia of the time. When he's writing about what witches are doing, he's writing about what people are afraid witches were doing, and specifically what James was reacting to. Think of it as the equivalent of a thriller with a bunch of domestic terrorists. Okay, these are the popular anxieties as reflected in the popular culture of that time. In terms of cliche, as I mentioned with the late Lancashire witches, there is a genre of witch drama that is really popular several decades later. And so at least of the things that we know that survive of plays from when he was writing, which would have been the 1590s and the early 1600s, there's actually much less witchcraft depicted on stage. It's when you get into the period under King James where witches start appearing much more.
Very cool, thank you. So do you think that there's a particular manuscript that has influenced modern pop culture's conception of witchcraft, or is that Shakespeare's, or would you say there's something else? Or has it morphed too much over the past 4 to 5 centuries?
I would vote for the Malleus Maleficarum. Up until, of course, this is up until the end of the 1900s, witchcraft has been taboo and not socially acceptable and all of these things. And that is due in a major way to the Malleus and how it portrays witches, how it portrays women, and how Europe reacted to witches and all of the things after this. So it's lasting results for driving force behind how witches were hunted and persecuted and tried. It was used as evidence in witchcraft trials. That's my vote, the long-standing one. Do you have a vote, Cait? Okay.
So since Cait's in agreement, you had mentioned taboo. So Ruthann, in the beginning of your lecture, someone had noticed that you talked about baby blood broomstick sex toys. So this is crazy. It's something that we still consider pretty taboo now. Was this so uncommon to write about then as it is now, or why would they even get away with something like that?
About using baby fat and flying on broomsticks? Yes,
yeah.
This was sensational literature. And let's be honest here, the scandal of a witch trial is why we all tuned in, right? I mean, everyone, it's fascinating to us now. It was fascinating to people of the contemporary time period. Yes, the church is looking and prosecuting, and women are dying, and it's all of these things are going on as well. But there's also this drive to have it broadcast to the public and for the public to know about this. And one of the best ways to get it out there is something that people are morbidly interested in watching or reading at this time or hearing about. So when you hear that babies are being kidnapped and taken to the woods, where women are having all kinds of relationships with everyone who is in the woods, including the devil, then you're, well, I want to know more. What happened? Tell me about this. And it becomes this thing that it's blown out of proportion, but everyone tunes in for it.
And to tack onto that, like, look at, what we're seeing in our own culture. Look at QAnon, look at Pizzagate. 2016, people were convinced that there was a child, like, slave ring being run out of a pizza joint in DC, and people went in with armed to go liberate them, and it was just a pizza place. Like, anytime you can use stuff to demonize other people, humans, like, latch onto that. It's just human nature, sadly.
Yeah, thank you both. So another question, was the class of the women who were accused taken into consideration?
Sure. Sorry, our who wants this discussion over here. Yes and no. I would say yes, because the accusations, of course, are mostly directed at lower class women. This comes from like the neighbor whose cow dies after a confrontation with the spinster next door, and the neighbor decides that this is witchcraft and makes an accusation. Those types of things happen all the time, but this is not to say that women of the upper class are completely immune. They're happening too. This falls more into Cait's timeline, and I'll pass it off to her for those, but it's all classes. It's not necessarily one or the other. You just, of course, peasants tend to take the brunt of things, which is standard for history.
So what I'm doing is I'm pulling up the list of people from the late Lancashire, or not, the discovery of the Lancashire witches. And so you can see, like, the names of the people. This is the list of people who are on trial for their lives. And to also, like, jump onto another question I saw in chat about men. Look at this sex breakdown. Anne Whittle, Elizabeth Device, James Device, Anne Redfern, Alice Snyder, Catherine Hewitt, John Bulcock, Jane Bulcock, Alison Device, Isabel Roby. Okay, so this gives you, like, an idea of, like, the gender breakdown of who would be considered culpable. You have two guys here, and you have a bunch of women. So men were absolutely accused of witchcraft. They too died. These are all people who did not make it. I'm blanking. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think Anne Redfern was one of these women. It was a wealthy widow from the time period. She was landed. She had wealth. I hope that was Anne Redfern. I think it is. But one of the reasons that they went after her was because she did have land. And actually, one of the things that came up with the examiners who were going through this, I mentioned they were rewarded for such a good job that they did, that they got better jobs with higher salaries and some land. That this is what happens when people in power use that power to abuse others, depending on what station in life. If you were like Alison Device, she was a little old lady. She was like 80 something. Why would you, like, be picking a fight with her in the middle of the street, except little old lady? But this gives you an idea of, like, the casual vulnerability of people just depending. And if there's something that you have that other people decide they want, they will try to use what they have against you.
Oh, thank you both. Here's a question that we'll ask about your personal experience. So, has studying the history of witchcraft and of accused witches impacted you as women and scholars? Are there parallels? Well, let's stop with that. We'll just start with that question.
Oh man, bringing out the deep thoughts on a Thursday night, huh? Okay, so one thing that I'm constantly aware of is that I am a scholar who I like popular topics, and I also like studying gender. And I'm very lucky that I have always ended up at institutions that have supported me, and they have supported my work. Depending on where you are working or where you are, you can definitely see people who are given a rough time. And that's not just touching on magic or witchcraft or things like that. This can be anything that's considered unpopular or something scholars can poo-poo. And depending on what field you're in and trends and fads, that can vary widely. um when I personally think about the work that I'm doing, I focus mostly on popular culture. More typically, I also look at vampires in popular culture because I think they're really interesting in how they too are always culture anxieties. The idea of what we think of as predator and dangerous changes over time, but there's always some similarities to that. Um, yeah, I'm gonna tag that onto that. Ruthann, your turn.
Okay. Let's see. I would second, also really strongly second the I've been lucky to be at institutions that are okay with what I am studying. Not all institutions would be cool with women. And I study medieval supernatural, which is even like one step further. So that aspect of it is really fortunate as well. Um, Personally, I tend to struggle with, because I'm studying the medieval period, a lot of the material that I look at is from men, by men, for men. And it becomes this thing that you have to kind of dig through and wade through sometimes to be able to get at the women or get at the different audiences or things like that. And I really personally, researching witchcraft gives that kind of in-depth look at looking at a marginalized group in society.
Great. Thank you so much. So speaking of the supernatural, someone earlier had asked about the Werewolf Mania. Were there any parallels or, I guess, overlap between Werewolf Mania and the sensationalism of witchcraft that we know of, that y'all know of?
Okay, so we were looking at each other and we were like, do you know much about that? Do you know? I know a little. The werewolf mania that I know of is primarily in the 18th century in France. I don't know if that's what the person is referencing. That's the only part that I know. But it does again come into culture anxieties and boogeymen. Particularly in the mid 18th century, there was the Beast of Lavant, which apologies if I mispronounce that. My French is non-existent. But there was this beast that was killing people, and there was speculations that it was a werewolf, and there was a kind of popular literature revolving around lycanthropy and stuff like that. But what that kind of ties into what it prior to the French Revolution is these all of the abuses and murders and stuff that happen among the lower classes. It's all of this creepy stuff that the peasantry are out doing, and isn't that really neat and fascinating in a really reality TV kind of way? And of course, meanwhile, in real life, you have a populace that is abused and starving to death, and eventually gets to the point where they have had enough of this, basically. So there's a couple of different ways to read that. And if that's not what you're talking about, I'm sorry, and I don't know. And I want to tag Ruthann now.
Mine comes from mostly traditional religion and folk and pagan. It's very minimal. Human shapeshifters have kind of like always been a thing, and wolves are, boogeymen, the thing that kind of happens. People who exist on the fringes of society, kind of thing. I know that's not super helpful, but it exists in pagan tradition.
Well, thank you both. Back to witchcraft. Can you comment on how the fall of the commons and the rise of capitalism led to the devaluing of women's work, especially older women, leading to the specific targeting of, quote, non-productive members of society as witches?
Can I? Okay, you guys are going to hear way too much about my PhD research, and I apologize in advance. Okay, so when you're talking, and I assume by fall of the commons, you're talking about in the 17th century when the kind of common lands are being. The idea was in England and the British Isles, you had areas called the commons, and these were open areas that were shared by everybody. In the 17th century and into the 18th, basically class warfare kicks in seriously, and so there is this idea of starting to privatize public property. There is actually an early movement called the Diggers, which are they're kind of 17th century Green Party people. They believe in fostering a kind of a ecologically friendly kind of society and things like that. And there's a really amazing piece by, oh man, I'm Gerard, somebody Gerard. Basically what he does is he rewrites the Bible as the apple basically being the discovery of property, and once you start to take fruit and identify as something that can be consumed, that's when the sin of man happens. It's amazing, y'all. And so what you see with the way the actual kind of pre-industrial systems work is it's very guild heavy. What you see is people would basically, it's kind of like an early kind of higher education. The idea is for membership, you would buy a spot for your kid into professional training. They would spend the next several years working off this debt. And when they've paid off, or when they've reached the age of 24, whichever comes first, they are freed, and then they become journeymen, and then they can go into business for themselves. Okay, this is a guild system that in England has worked for several hundred years. Obligatory disclaimer, I am again focusing on England because that's what I know. I know much less about guild systems on the continent. Okay, so what you also see in the 17th century, particularly in the printing trades, is you see a sudden influx of women as stationers, which are printers, booksellers, things like that, and scriveners, aka public notaries. But if you compare that to other guilds, you will have seen women present several hundred years earlier. The Guild of Fletchers, people who make bows and arrows, the Guild of Mercers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Someone in the chat, Gerard Winstanley, yes, thank you. Things I try to remember on Thursday night. And so what you see, the system kind of, its demise is actually on par with the birth of the industrial pre-industrial units in the 18th century, right? And so is this kind of, all of a sudden the population expands dramatically. Because of this, the middle class starts to expand dramatically. The guild system, the archaic guild system basically cannot keep up. And so what you have there is a switch in basically going from artisanal, well-paid people with functional union protections and other things to people who are being paid by the hour and very poorly. When it comes to the devaluing of women's work, again, this is something where depending on what guild you're in, that would absolutely matter. So for instance, if you were looking at women as guild members, or who are not allowed in the guild, they are being paid much, much less than their male counterparts. The idea of the specific targeting of non-productive members of society, however, that is something that actually is very on par with the Puritan movement and stuff like that. Into the 16th and 17th century, you could actually be accused of being a vagrant or being unemployed and stuff, and people would get very angry at you and try to send you to jail or otherwise discipline you for not having a job, which was not necessarily a function of laziness, although that is something the powers that be argued it was. It was also a function of a rapidly changing workforce. Does any of this sound familiar? I'm going to shut up.
Thank you so much, Cait.
I am politely passing this back to Madeline because this is past my time period.
Okay. Yeah, and also we do have a lot of other questions. Are y'all comfortable continuing with the Q&A? Getting some head nods. Perfect. Here's one that came in from Facebook or YouTube, I'm not sure. But were animals who were believed to be witches' familiars also put on trial and executed? As a dog owner, I'm very personally invested in this.
Okay, so I know enough about this to get into profound trouble. Okay, so first of all, it wasn't just the idea of persecuting animals as witches and stuff like that. You actually had legal precedent to put any animal on trial because reasons. Like there's a famous one where like a horse kicks somebody in the head and they die. So then the town puts the horse on trial and the horse ends up getting hanged for murder, apparently. No, I don't remember the title of this. A friend of mine who does medieval stuff told me about it, so I can't give you citations, for which I apologize. But basically there was a cultural, it was something you could do, would be to charge animals with crimes and stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Coker. Here's another question. Can you explain how ubiquitous magical beliefs were so we can better understand from a modern perspective?
So if we're talking about how we define magical beliefs is really important here. If we're talking about magic as in how we're defining with witchcraft and like the Malefic and the demonology and all of those things, then the trials are pretty pervasive. Most people are familiar with how massive the witch hunts were and the witch craze after that, the burning times. So not that it's pervasive, but people thought that it was. If we're if we're not defining magic as demonolatry or maleficia and doing those, then if you're defining it through pagan belief and rituals, folk rituals, traditional religion, then thousands of years and lots. Before Rome and before Christianity came to Rome, ritual was an everyday part of life, multiple times a day part of life, and it was just what you did and how you lived. And this is true for all of the Roman Empire, the Greeks, the Egyptians. Ritual is pervasive in not European, but pre-European cultures. Did you want to jump in here?
Thank you so much. We had just a shout out to Dr. Cait Coker, letting people know that her recently published book is The Global Vampire, Essays on the Undead in Popular Culture Around the World. So snaps to Dr. Coker. Congratulations on your recent publication. We have a pop culture question. Why in modern day do we assume the witch is green? Why is the witch green?
Hollywood. So the Wizard of Oz comes out in the 1930s, right? And so, at the time it was this big spectacle, and it starts in black and white in the real world, and then Dorothy goes to Oz, and it's in fantastic Technicolor, right? And it's amazing and fascinating. And in the 1930s, when that was being shot, this was cutting edge, sexy technology. Now, when you're already using cutting edge technology and you have to introduce your villain, the Wicked Witch of the West, what are you going to do? How can you make her look even scarier? You paint her green. That's really weird and creepy, right? Totally. It successfully scares generations of children watching on TV into hiding behind the couch. Me too. And so it's very different. When you go back and you actually read the book, the Wicked Witch isn't green. There's no reference to that at all. Similarly, we think of the iconic, ruby slippers, right? In the book, she has silver slippers. And so they were using that brand new technology of bright colors to just make everything, just kick it up a few notches. And we see the movie, and that's what we think the text is. And that's not, that's not reflective of the original text, but it looks good on TV.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coker. Here's another question. Do you think that the burning times could surface again, but in the United States? And are you seeing any trends that are similar now that were in medieval times?
I think this is going to be another mutual answered question. Historically speaking, they already have the Salem witch trials, and are, pretty common. The was it the 1950s, the communist witch hunt, that they called it a witch hunt. It was neighbor turning on neighbor, reporting people, same kind of situation, except they were accused of being communists instead of witches. There's still periods of time they still happen. Did you want to, Kate?
And to tag on to that, let's look at, how, popular or contemporary neo-pagans are treated, right? Historically, this has been something that would be used to, if you are a practicing pagan of, any kind, historically, that would be something that could be used against you in the court of law. To take away your kids, to make getting a divorce easier, to justify getting fired, things like that. If you think about, what was it, 2007 was when the US military finally allowed you, if you were a pagan service member who wanted to have the symbols of your religion placed on your military headstone, you would not have been allowed to do that until 2007. At the same time, people who are of minority faiths of any kind are regularly, they get treated poorly. We know this. Look at the news. Look at what happens to Muslim people. Look at, Jewish students. Anybody who happens to come from minority faith can get treated badly. In terms of something along the lines of the burning times, for those who are not aware, that's something I referenced that obliquely when I was talking. During the early days of the Protestant Reformation, many thousands of people were burned. We're looking at numbers. They are estimating now roughly between 40 to 60,000 people were executed. Previous estimates, I think, from scholarship in the 80s and 90s had that something like roughly 2 million, if I'm recalling, but now the number is more or less, I think, accepted as 40 to 60,000. And there was the overlap between people who were accused of witches or who were being, they are witches because they're Protestants, right? And this idea of, mass incarceration, mass executions, and so on and so forth. Look at ethnic cleansing and, almost anywhere in the world. Let's be blunt. Let's look at what's happening with the Uyghurs in China right now, okay? this is just something that happens. It is dependent on all kinds of different cultures. All countries take a turn to go crazy at some point. That's cheerful.
Thank you for that, Dr. Coker and Ruthann. Here's another question. What was the tipping point for the ecclesiastical authorities going from not taking witches seriously to acknowledging their existence and threat? Quote unquote threat.
Okay, so the 1400s is kind of when things start to change a little bit. Pagan tradition, folk, ritual, like all of these things, and Christianity have a very tenuous relationship for very many years prior to the 1400s, right? So there's this balance between Christianity just turning, not necessarily hunting down someone because they're still doing their rituals or whatever that they are doing, and then openly going after and accusing them of heresy, right? In the 1400s, I touched a little bit about how demonology becomes a thing. Prior to that, God, angels, demons, devils, like these are spiritual entities. You can't touch them. Like you pass through, you can't interact with them in a physical way. The shift that happens is when theologians start trying to make the case that you can interact with them in a physical, corporeal manner. And part of the way that they're making the case is that women are having carnal relationships with demons. And in order to do that, the demon has to have a body, right? You can't partake in all of the physical aspects of sex without having a physical body, right? So if a demon has a body, and the witches are, of course, are also having these relations with the devil. So if the demon and the devil have physical bodies and you can interact with them, they're real, right? That means that their counterpoints, God and the angels, are also real. And this is proving their existence. And so, yes, there's a whole bunch of misogyny going on here. And yes, there's a whole bunch of other stuff underneath of the surface. However, texts like the Malleus also talk about the theological reasons why that demons exist. And they're proving the existence of demons through witches' relationships with them, which ultimately proves the existence of God, which is like, you really want to prove this. This is like the penalty, like you got to prove this if you're a theologian, right? So that's kind of, I don't want to say it's the tipping point for how witches are becoming persecuted. There's also a level of heresy and just the church isn't putting up with ritual practice anymore. That is a thing, but they're also trying to make a different argument here as well.
Thank you so much. So another question, are there any parallels you see in society today in regards to interpreting female behavior as witch-like? I don't think the look and see who's going to talk is ever going to get old for me, so.
We will eventually manage, telepathy, but until then, we will just kind of look and like go, okay, so in terms of what could be witch-like, okay, first of all, quick rec for a book by Mary Beard that came out a couple of years ago where she talks about women in power, and she's talking specifically about political women in power and how they are always demonized, not just by political opponents, but by people in society. Okay, there is always in all levels a cultural anxiety about what women are doing. Is it okay? I mean, again, human nature, what, you have to kind of keep people corralled. And it's one of those things that, like, I study the popular vampire, and so people are always like, so, like, Kate, what did you think of Twilight? And, my response is, well, I don't know about, the book spit didn't do anything for me, but oh my God, watching people lose their minds about, what young women readers could be getting out of like romance novels was like, I mean, people lost their minds. It was amazing. There's always this kind of cultural paranoia about what women are up to. what do women think is sexy? Is it too bad? Is it hurting their little women brains? And the thing is like this cultural anxiety. I mean, it does go back hundreds of years. You look at again Shakespeare's Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and she has like the "unsex me now" speech, and that's the part where we, the audience, are supposed to be like, she's not like, she's giving up her, like, women domestic stuff, and she's like on par with her husband. Oh man, now we know we're in for it, right? And like that's just something that just keeps going, is what are women doing? What do women like? Do they like it too much? I'm kind of rambling here, but the societal expectations of how women behave and how they are supposed to behave is just omnipresent at all times. And I'm a woman scholar, and I'm just like, really?
I think we definitely encourage the ramble. Ruthann, would you like to add something?
Okay, so I'm gonna go off the okay. Seduction is a thing, right? It's a woman's power persuasion. The question of her, be careful how you lay with your wife, because her female parts might entrap you and then ruin your life, right? This is a trope that is seen throughout history, by the way. Even the Romans were concerned about female power, right? This is also something that gets seen a lot when we're talking about witchcraft and magic, because a woman can ensorcerel you, she can enspell you. A woman has the power to cast the spell on you, to make you act a certain way. And if we're putting that in modern context, it's the woman is casting something upon, it is the woman who is the one who is casting this this spell, this making this man react this way. He's just under her spell. That's witchcraft. Not that it's real, but yeah. I'm gonna stop my rant.
Thank you both. That was great. I really appreciate that our little woman brains can handle this conversation tonight. It's definitely wonderful. All right, so we have someone who'd like to hear more about Lilith. And if either presenter knows much about the Book of Lilith that was taken out of the Bible as we know it today.
Okay. All right. I am not a theologian, and I don't study the Bible. I feel like I should preface this before I start talking about biblical things. So from what my background knowledge is on, if you're not familiar, Lilith is created before Eve. Adam and Lilith are created, they're not kind of together, right? But Lilith is not created of Adam, like the rib thing with Eve. Lilith is her own thing. And the story goes that Lilith is not a subservient enough woman, essentially. We'll put it that way. And so she is replaced by Eve, who was created from Adam's rib. And Lilith has this story attached to her where she is eschewing all of these womanly attributes, like subservience, obedience to the man, holding her tongue, not having an opinion, the whole little brain thing again, right? And Lilith is the opposite of this. And for this, Lilith is cast as a demon, the original demoness, and sent down to hell, where Lucifer, the devil, is. And that's kind of the story of how Lilith goes. But I can't comment on the removal of the Book of Lilith from the Bible, but Lilith comes up a whole bunch when you're talking about how women are perceived in Christianity and how they're demonized a whole bunch. And she's held up as this example of, this is how a woman should not be. And this is what happens when you act that way. You go to hell. Only good women, Eve, get to go to heaven. So she becomes this figure of how not to be. And I mean, not super recently, but in the end of the 1900s, that's kind of turned around, and Lilith has kind of become this, hey, Lilith is kind of cool kind of figure. So from a scholarly point, it's nice to see her turn around.
And to tag onto that, like, and again, this is, I know enough to get into trouble, but in the Jewish Midrash, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Words I've never heard spoken out loud before, and saying them is dangerous. But there's the story of there's Lilith and Eve, and then there's an unnamed wife in between. Because when Lilith is cast out, again, she, was too powerful, not a good wife. There she goes. And then there's an unnamed second wife who God starts from nothing, and Adam has to watch her being formed. And so it like starts like an innate kind of body horror, because he gets to see all of the squishy bits that are terrifying. And particularly you think in medieval and in ancient times, and the early taboos against menstrual blood and things like this, and this idea of like the inherent disgustingness of women. And so this second woman was too fleshy and mucousy and everything, and Adam couldn't handle it, and then so she just gets destroyed out of hand. And then that's when you get to Eve, who is the one made out of the rib. And so you have that kind of spectrum of women in the Judeo-Christian thingy. Also, Lilith from seasons 3 and 4 of Supernatural, because I will work in whenever I can.
I'm so glad you're hooked on the Supernatural. We also have, so the staff of Champaign Public has been doing an amazing job moderating a lot of our comments, and we have our own chat feed, and it's been great seeing the Supernatural memes and love. So here's another question. Why do you feel Wicca and other neo-pagan religions have such an allure to people in the modern era, even though there is such a history of persecution and the risk of possible vilification even now?
Okay, we're going to take turns with this, and here's hoping. Okay, so me personally, here's what I think. I think that culturally there are always people who innately have an allure of what is forbidden. And if what is forbidden is certain kinds of practice, whatever they may be, that's what they are going to veer to. If you look at other, marginalized religions over the period of time, like you look at something like Mormonism and how people in the 19th century treated that religion, there are people who were drawn to it and practiced it, felt a pride in how they were treated badly by the rest of society. Similarly, I think there are a number of people who of neo-pagan faiths who feel that they get something out of being outsiders of society in general. I also think it's worth remarking upon that there is an idea of Wicca as being inherently feminist, and I think that's kind of inaccurate. I think one of the things that kind of muddies the lines a bit is, particularly here in America, we have a popular Wicca tradition that is very different from Wicca as British traditional witchcraft from the 19th and early 20th century. And so I think kind of keeping these things in mind as to what people are actually practicing and why they are practicing it is going to vary extensively depending on exactly what it is that they're doing. That makes sense.
Okay, I'm just gonna point out that they never went away. Like, it didn't stop. Pagan traditions, yes, they've changed, of course. Everything changes, right? But it's not like they went from pre-Christian Rome and just disappeared. They've just always been here, and whether or not they've been socially acceptable is whether or not you can talk about it. Obvious reasons, in the 14 to 1700s, if you are a practicing pagan, you aren't telling anybody you are a practicing pagan because someone's going to accuse you of witchcraft. So it's just something that is not completely socially acceptable, but a lot more than it used to be. So it's something that can be addressed and brought out into the open a lot more than it once could be.
And to kind of tag on to that, one thing I remember being really interesting was a few years ago at the Athens, Greece Olympics, right? It was like the centennial or something And what they did for the symbolic opening was they had a bunch of people dress up as kind of classical Greek priests and priestesses and do a little ritual. And in Greece, that was actually controversial because the pagan practitioners of Greece, who, you know, there probably is some remnant that has survived several thousand years ago, and then there's also the Hellenic reconstructionists who have been trying to reconstruct their practice from what's going on. Anyway, they were furious that the country of Greece would prefer to hire attractive actors to do a fake ritual when they could have asked the nice locals who actually knew what they were doing for it. But because Greece is they have Greek Orthodox Christianity, it's like they're not going to touch the local pagans with a 10-foot pole, despite, you know, the fact that we think of them as being like the classical mythology and ritual and so on and so forth.
Very cool. So from like an ethnographic standpoint, have either of you ever been trusted and allowed to view or participate in any of these practices that you study?
Okay, so I will say that for me personally, okay, how to say this? Okay, so depending on what tradition you're talking about, they really do not want outsiders there. And I have some very good friends who are like, Cait, we love you. You're awesome. But you don't go where we go, so we're not going to let you come over. And you know what? I'm cool with that. I respect that. I think that, you know, in terms of what people are willing to share and so on and so forth, that's something that's it's not just an individual matter, it's something of practical matter. Like again, if you draw like an example from another culture, like Mormon temples, and you're not allowed to go in them if you are not Mormon. That's basically the how the rule is, right? But there are times like when like the temple is being built, or before it's consecrated or something like that, where for a limited time period people can go in to visit as tourists, basically, right? And so it's this idea of, depending on what your religion is and how institutionalized it is, those rules are going to vary immensely. Also, quick book rec, Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, which is a classic, is a big ethnographic study. There was an update that she did in 2005, maybe. Anyway, to get an idea of like just a broad range of practice with like hard numbers and things, that's a good book to go to.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. And this one is, astrology used to be considered a science, and an important royal one at that. Was there a certain person or event that led its fall from grace? They're conferring.
Our raised eyebrows at each other. I'm going to say that it didn't fall from grace in the medieval period, so I'm deferring to Cait.
And I'm going to say it was okay. So I always the disclaimer, focusing on England. I mentioned Queen Elizabeth had her royal astrologer John Dee, right? So it was good then. When James comes to power again, he's super paranoid, and so people who are into these kinds, it becomes, you know, not a normal thing. It becomes something you can do if you want, and then you get to you seriously get into the Puritanism, who are really staunchly no to everything, right? It is, for like another example, if you look at like the Salem witch trials, like they weren't doing astrology per se, but they were doing it's now considered widely that one of the things that they did that really got people upset was they were doing like a primitive like divination thing to see who the girls would be marrying and stuff, and people absolutely wigged over that. And I think that culturally, because, you know, the United States did draw so heavily from exiled Puritan culture that's why we in particular have been very resistant in a mainstream way of like taking astrology seriously or looking at it as a norm of practice. I think that was a rambling answer.
All right, well, thank you. And I lied. We just got in another question from YouTube, and it's too good not to ask. So here's the official last question. And it is, so how were books like Grimoires produced and circulated in the Middle Ages? And how did these books make it into present day? And I feel like this question also encompasses a lot of the manuscripts you have at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. How have they stayed in such amazing condition for the age that they are?
Sure. For the medieval period with grimoires being circulated, if we're not talking about novelties here, they would have been like generational family type of things. Think like family Bibles that get passed down within families so that the knowledge stays there. And then that just sometimes it's just luck which books make it the centuries into make it into modern day. If something is being produced as a primer or grimoire, then it has a better chance of surviving and making it into more hands, which ups its chances to make it into modern day publications. We don't have any grimoires. I can't think of any off of the top of my head where they would be located. That's a good point. Cornell has a fantastic witchcraft collection. I would recommend looking there. They might actually have one, but they're going to be really rare. Medieval manuscripts are rare, and the ones from the margins of society are even more so. So it makes it harder to get. For the ones that do survive, they survive because a lot of them were produced and they just were pervasive enough. Someone really liked this book and they kept it. One of the what's the word I'm looking for that survives in the most amount books from the medieval period are books of hours, and they're essentially like little prayer books or prayers that you do at a certain hour of the day. And a whole bunch of them survive because they were like treasured objects. You carried them with you. They were really important to people. And they'd get passed down along in families and things like that. Plus, most of them are gorgeous. They're illuminated and they're illustrated, and you keep the pretty things, right? So that's how medieval books kind of make it through. And into that, you want to talk about the printed ones?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this from like a physical point of view, and I pulled out our little craft of conjuring again, and what I want to show off is how we're lucky to have this book at all. Okay, I'm going to zoom in as close as I can on my document camera. This is a tear in the middle of the book that has been fixed. The fact of the matter is that with a lot of books, the way they survive is crazy random happenstance and luck. That is why, even with something as super popular as Shakespeare's works or things like that, there are titles that we suspect have been lost. There are books that we know once existed or basically read to death. You can look at this individual manuscript. You can see it's had a hard life. Okay, look at how well thumbed these pages are. If I were wearing gloves, this would do so much damage to that. Look at the staining on this paper. Now, on the flip side, because of just the material making of books from several hundred years ago, they're using good rag paper. The chemical composition of this paper is helping to survive in a way that many other papers won't survive. If I zoom in closer, however, you can see how dark some of this handwriting is. That's because the ink that was used to write this is iron gall ink. This was used with actual iron shavings as part of the basis of it. And what does iron do? It rusts. That means with some manuscripts, they are basically burning themselves inside out. If you have something really written with ink that's went really bad, will end up holding a page that looks like lace. And what do you do if you have a book in your house that is falling apart and it's really gross most of the time? You're going to throw it away. You're going to wrap your fish and chips in it. You're going to use it for wrapping paper or whatever. So frankly, like anything that survives from several hundred years ago is an individual minor miracle as far as librarians are concerned. But at the same time, one of the interesting challenges is if you compare to think about like a lot of the really poor papers of the 20th century, comic books. We all know that really crummy newspaper, right? That's falling apart. It's a really kind of interesting kind of conundrum that we can have books that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and just as long as we avoid fire and water and other bad things, they will survive hundreds of years more. Whereas you have things that are much newer, but they're not going to last beyond a couple of decades because they're destroying themselves because of their innate chemical nature.
Very cool. Well, thank you both again so much. This was one of the most amazing presentations I think that has ever happened at the Champaign Public Library. And thank you again for involving the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Illinois with just here. It's been incredible. We have had over 3,000 individuals join us this evening from across the world. So another round of applause for Dr. Cait Coker and Ruthann Miller. And also have you know that people are shipping for a podcast, book release, merchandise. We're here for it. So I hope you all who are enjoying this at home, who have enjoyed this at home, again, know that Champaign Public Library, we have a lot of additional free webinars. You can find them online at our website, www.champaign.org. Make sure you also check out the Rare Book and Manuscript Library's website, their social media. They have a lot of other presentations and webinars coming up in the future, and I don't know about you, but I will anxiously be awaiting all of them, including Rambly podcasts, especially Rambly podcasts. All right. Well, we're wishing everyone an enchanted evening, and thank you again for tuning in.